We're going to get underway. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Michael Waits. I am the Sub-Regional Secretary for Oceania for Public Services International, which is a global union federation of public sector workers. I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land where we meet today and thank them for their warm welcome this morning. This session is going to be having a look at livelihoods, and we've got four great speakers. The way this session is going to run is a little bit different to the way we've seen it run so far today. I'm going to throw a question to each of the panellists once I introduce them, or I'll just let them talk. So we'll hear from each of our panellists, and then I've got a microphone and I want to walk around the room and get you all to ask some questions of our panellists and get a bit of a debate or discussion going. So don't worry about your pieces of paper. Feel free to hit Twitter, of course, but start thinking about your questions as you listen to our great panel. And I'm going to start with Lila, who has 30 years of involvement in industrial relations policy and practice in a variety of roles. She's recently completed a thesis on relationships between international investment agreements, labour standards and progressive law reform. And so in thanking Lila, I guess the obvious question to ask you is how have trade agreements affected workers' rights, and what are some of the fundamentals that have been problematic?
Thanks, Michael. Well, first of all, I just want to say that there are obviously much broader impacts of trade and investment agreements on workers and employment than I'm going to address today. My specific focus today is on the impact of the labour rules, the labour chapters, or the references to labour standards that are increasingly present in free trade and investment agreements. In New Zealand, they have been largely to date in the form of what are sort of memorandums of understanding between New Zealand and various bilateral trading and investment partners, so China, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. And so they are not enforceable, but they are understandings about how each party will conduct itself in relation to labour rules and labour standards domestically. The most recent agreement, the tppa, includes a full chapter on labour, which is supposedly enforceable. But I just want to come to the issue of how these rules do or don't impact. And basically, there are two kind of principal issues here. One is, do these rules enable countries to improve or protect their labour standards, their existing labour standards? And the second is, are the elements in these agreements which actually prevent countries from improving or protecting their existing labour standards? And in my assessment, having looked at hundreds of agreements and quite in a lot of detail at the last 50 that have been negotiated globally, and looking at all the cases there have been on the enforcement of labour rules in trade and investment agreements, or issues that have arisen from that, if we did away with labour rules and labour standards in the agreements, if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be in a worse position than we are. Because the detriment of those agreements to jobs and workers is well beyond any arguable benefit from the labour rules and the labour standards. The second conclusion that I've reached from looking at these is that the investment rules, so in particular the rules around that enable investors to sue governments for regulatory interventions, although to date they have not had a negative impact on labour regulation, that, in my view, is only because no country has entered into a process of transformational labour law reform over the last 30 or 40 years, which is also the period of, you know, the real growth and explosion of investor-state dispute settlement. If you look at it theoretically and look at what could happen if, for instance, the living wage campaign, you know, or the social procurement advocates really succeeded in pressuring through organising and mobilisation and getting regulatory, you know, and getting rules, government rules or local government rules that are really transformative of labour rights, then I have no doubt that we would be vulnerable to litigation, and that the way these agreements have been drafted, including the CPTPP, which our Minister of Trade describes as a gold standard agreement, do not have protections in them for the policy space we would need if we had a reassertion of trade unionism and a really successful momentum for progressive labour law reform of the kind, you know, many in this room would aspire to. That's my 25 words or less. The cornflakes version.
The cornflakes version. We'll certainly see if we can get to the bottom of the box for the prize by the end of this conversation then. I want to go to, actually I want to ask a rhetorical question maybe for the room and for yourself as we get into the debate. And that is that if the reality of the Labor, if the reality is that if the Labor chapters were removed, we'd be no worse off, is there any point of us being at the table? That's rhetorical for the moment. And I want to go to Dennis. And Dennis is from First Unions, and he's the General Secretary. And he's well known and respected for his advocacy on work on migrant employment matters. Yeah. And so the big question here is that if the free trade agreements aren't that great for workers, how is it for migrant workers?
Okay. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you for that, Michael. I think the hardest always to discuss is the connection of free trade agreement and labor migration without discussing about what is the effect in terms of the perspective of sending countries. I think one thing I would like to establish is this. Since the neoliberal inception, free trade agreements did not actually create sustainable jobs in sending countries. In fact, it was actually the cause of deindustrialization, the backwardness of their agriculture, the cause of massive unemployment. And when you discuss about free trade agreement, it's all about remittances, okay? And when you talk about remittances, would you believe that remittances right now outweigh the overseas development assistance? In fact, there are many sending countries now that are heavily dependent on remittances. In fact, in 2014, that was actually the highest number of remittances recorded by the World Development Bank. It was $608 billion. And if ever you look at that, coming to that perspective, there are 4 countries that are actually benefiting this kind of remittances. The number 1 country is India. They got around $60 to $69 billion from 2012. The next one is China, even though it has a lot of capital nowadays. They actually delivered $60 billion. The next one is Philippines, all right? And which has $24 billion. And the 4th one is actually Mexico. In terms of benefiting from these remittances. And these countries nowadays, instead of creating sustainable jobs, they don't. In fact, what they do now is actually strengthen their labor market institutions to actually export their labor force. And New Zealand and Australia are countries in the Pacific where we actually benefit from that, but we do not ask questions. For example, if ever we employ nurses in New Zealand, then how about the health system in the Philippines, for example? The health system in India, Would there be a shortage there? We never asked that questions. I think that is the problem in terms of the labor migration aspect and the free trade agreement. And the second one, if ever you look at the perspective about how the developed countries and sending countries actually correlate in this, because some of them are arguing that, hey, free trade agreement will actually increase productivity. If ever you go actually to NAFTA, for 8 years of existence of NAFTA, yes, it increased the productivity by 50%, but there was actually a massive decline in wages. Okay? And if ever you look at the population of Mexicans now living in the US, because of that NAFTA, it actually increased 80% of their population. So meaning a lot of companies right now are heavily relying on a cheap labor export policy of different countries. So that is actually a problem for us. And now when it comes to labor migration, the next question is that how the government actually can protect those migrant workers in the host country, because that's a lack of understanding as well in terms of their situation nowadays. In fact, it is very important for us to understand the free trade agreement, let alone the bilateral agreement, because it shaped the migration policy. So migration is like actually a gate. How much do you open up the gate for those migrants? And if ever you don't actually ask questions, what's happening actually in the sending countries, you wouldn't be able to understand what will be the effect of this in the host country. That's for mine. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. And so the rhetorical question has to be that if the FTAs are about sustainable development, then shouldn't that mean that the migrant workforce would dry up? If we had true development in each country, then why would you need to flee to another country to get better wages and better conditions? Now, I want to move to Tanya, who is going to talk a little bit about sustainable jobs. And Tanya is a social entrepreneur in Auckland Council. And a social entrepreneur is someone who works inside a big organisation to develop and promote practical solutions to social or environmental challenges, where progress is currently stalled by market failures, applying the principles of social entrepreneurship. And so, Tanya, how does this relate to free trade agreements and how do they counter sustainability?
Ko te mea tuatahi, he mihi atu ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe, ko ngā te whātua, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. He mihi atu hoki ki ngā kai whakahaere o tō tātou hui. Ngā mihi mahana kia koutou katoa, ko Tānia Pauwhare ahau, he uriau no ngai tūhoi. He social entrepreneur, kai te kaunihiro tāmaki makaurau. Kia ora koutou, my name is Tānia Pauwhare and I'm a social entrepreneur with the Auckland Council. And I work in a very small team called the Southern Initiative. And we are basically a social innovation think and do tank that's focused on some of our really tough challenges and grappling with those challenges that are present in South Auckland. And my colleague Tere Moana is here as well. One of our priorities is creating shared prosperity, and we're tiny, we're very lean in resource, but our job is to demonstrate that just, inclusive, circular and regenerative economic development is possible. And that encompasses all the work we do around employment and skills and entrepreneurship and procurement. We are very fortunate in that we're kind of insider-outsiders. So we work at grassroots with individuals and their whānau, and particularly those who are farthest from the labour market. And we also have access to the system, and we can take all those learnings that we have of working at the grassroots level, and then feed that back into the massive bureaucracies that have a real direct impact on people's lives. One of the things that we've been doing is using the council family's procurement, which is, you know, really significant. We spend $3 billion a year just buying stuff to really squeeze that purchasing power to create quality, and we've got a definition of what we mean by quality, employment and enterprise opportunity for South Auckland and Māori and Pasifika in particular. So one of the things that we've been doing is stipulating wage rates. So we, in the contracts, the requirement is, for example, to start our Māori and Pasifika trades training graduates, who are all construction, infrastructure and allied trades. We, stick to our knitting because that's what we as the council buy. And the starting rate is the living wage. Then the requirement is that the contractor or the supplier needs to get people up to $25 an hour within 12 months of employment. And at $25 an hour, which is only $50,000 a year, that's when we close the gap between the South Auckland median income and the rest of Auckland median income. And if you're a Pasifika person from South Auckland, it's 79% more than the median income. And then we require them to do it again for so within 24 months of employment to get people up to $27.50 an hour, because then we've created an advantage for South Aucklanders. And that's our job, is to create an advantage. I think we're very, very cognizant of the hard economic lessons of the South, and what happens when you don't focus on creating a workforce that is resilient to economic shock. And we see this repeatedly. Every time there's an economic shock, you see unemployment in the South completely pull away from the rest of Auckland, and then it doesn't actually ever recover. So I've just done a really kind of deep data dive of a 1 kilometre radius area in Māngere. And the median income in this area is $16,500 per annum. And it has actually reduced in both real and nominal terms since 2003. And it's equivalent to $10,000 in 2003 prices, and it's just not going to get better. So the whole the spiel about market failure is that's part of our job, is to intervene, because that is a market failure, and that is one of the things that I think characterises the South, and it's the generations of South Aucklanders that pay for it. One of the things that I think is really interesting, apart from having opportunities like this to lift our eyes to the horizon, because we're so in there, like with whānau, advocating, our whānau have very complex, the ones that we work with have very, very complex personal lives. So we have to get in there because it affects their employment, it affects the unreasonable burden of stress that people are under, and then they can't thrive and they can't create good livelihoods for them or their whānau. But we have a government who will be bringing out the first wellbeing budget next year. It speaks to everything that actually we stand for about, investing in human capital and social capital, as much as we do, kind of physical capital and also environmental capital. And therefore, all of our instruments need to reflect that. One of the things that I think for us about the CPTPP is how it might particularly affect us around local government, but also one of the things that I could see was around the offsets and what would labour market insertions be categorised as around domestic development, because that's something we rely very, very heavily on. And it's, we're in shaky ground anyway, and we could be judicially reviewed. All these things are untested. So what might that mean for us to be able to do those types of things so that, drive up wages, drive up the skills that are invested into people, and making that link between the global economy and that our domestic macroeconomy needs to reflect in all of its instruments what this government is saying that it wants in the future. Kia ora.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that story that you tell of your local government trying to drive up the minimum wage in your region. In Australia, we hear stories of local governments taking back control of waste removal services, because that way the wages are going back into their local community, and that's creating great benefits. So we have this tension of local progressive governments trying to create sustainable development within their communities. Meanwhile, we have progressive national parties signing the free trade agreements that will stop that. So I guess the rhetorical question for you at the moment is that what relationships do we need to break at the national level in order to allow local progressive governments achieve sustainable development? And I want to now ask Annie, who is the National Director of Campaigns at ETU, National Convener of the Living Wage Movement and Trustee for a new broad-based Auckland Community Alliance. Annie's going to talk about how government procurement needs to be able to meet the demands of communities.
Kia ora koutou. The Living Wage Movement came about because of a failure of regulation to support in any way the lowest paid workers in the country. So workers that E2 represents, who are cleaners or security guards, are not workers where you can raise the wages through the normal negotiation process, because the funding for those workers' wages comes from another source, and that source isn't at the bargaining table. So, for instance, with local government or central government, they hold the purse strings to a lot of those workers' wages, but the union negotiates with Armaguard or with Spotless or with whoever the company is that directly employs those people. So the idea behind the Living Wage Movement was that we would bring together the forces from beyond unions and beyond the bargaining table, forces from across civil society, to create sufficient voice and sufficient influence to bring about a change to the way that governments addressed questions of low pay and growing poverty and inequality in New Zealand. And so the Living Wage Movement needed to target more than just a labour relations regulatory environment. It needed to look to things like policy, the public policy around procurement, and how governments would do something about the way they entered into the contracts for services that they do with a lot of the companies that drive wages down, or that where wages are forced down because of that competitive tendering process. And I think that the way that we dealt with that and targeted central government and local government has proven to be really successful. There's a lot of possibility. So there's the wonderful example of what's happening with the Southern Initiative. But we have also got the first City Council over the line as a living wage employer. That's Wellington City Council. And the workers' stories from that council where their lives have been transformed are truly remarkable. And sometimes maybe it's only 30% increase in their income, and for many people, maybe even in this room, that amount of money, $20.55, isn't that much. But for these workers, it gives them a hope, and they suddenly start to plan, dream of doing things like taking families on holiday, like being able to go to tangi, which are where they need to get proper transport to, going home to see families in the islands. There's so many things where, in many ways, they are essentials that families juggle, and suddenly it's possible for them to pay for some of them. So the stories are very transformative. But getting Wellington City Council over the line was not without a legal challenge by the Chambers of Commerce, because they didn't believe that the council could set terms for their procurement of services. That in fact there's an objection to the idea that anything but the lowest possible price should apply. And we now have a central government that is committed to moving its core public service contracted workers to a living wage by the end of this electoral term. So again, for the first time, procurement's in the spotlight. And the biggest challenge around that stuff is that you're dealing with completely different people. We're trying through the living wage movement to close the gap between public officials and citizens so that people can organise in all the ways that we like to do it in order to influence public officials to make commitments and then to stick to them. And that's kind of what we hope democracy will deliver. So we try to do that, but then a procurement process takes place which is highly commercial. And really the interests of citizens are very much not in the front of their minds. So it will be very interesting to see how in a much more high public profile way, central government start to change their procurement policies so that those companies don't pay the lowest amount of money. And when you're looking at the types of companies, these are enormously wealthy companies like Armaguard. You know, they're big multinational firms that can afford to pay more. But the risk is that in that space that we are trying to close between kind of citizens and government, there are the trade agreements that set new terms so that in the end we lose hope that it's possible to organise something different. We lose hope that in fact we can collectively create a voice that can bring about the sorts of changes that we want. And so in some ways it's not just about the union power and it's not just about our ability to influence government, but it's about the weight that government put on the enabling of civil society organisations to do the work that they have to do to balance the power of the market. And so I think that those kinds of things are incredibly important if we want to protect democracy for the future and be able to give the people who are in our constituency some hope that they can bring about change.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. It's no error that there are an equal representation up here of unions and civil society, right, on the panel today. And you think about this question that if the union movement or the civil society movement alone is not strong enough and the need for everyone to come together, I guess the rhetorical question would be, what does the new social movement look like if we're going to change the way trade deals are done? And so now I want to move to the room, and questions are from the room. So if you've got a question, then please raise your hand because I'm going to bring the roving microphone around. And I might just ask a leading question whilst you all think about your question. We heard earlier that global structures are in crisis because the multinationals break, bend or ignore their rules, our rules, for their own purposes. So should workers and communities in defence of our livelihoods argue for a return to the old world order and a seat at that table? Or should we break existing bad laws in order to establish a community-focused new world order? And I want to have a go at that. Do we want a seat at the old table to debate the old rules and get back to the old rules? Or do we want to accept that the way you win at the moment, as demonstrated by multinationals, is to ignore the rules, break the rules, bend the rules? What should our movement do in order to create a better world?
Well, I'm happy to start. I'm sure everyone's got a view. I think that it's incredibly hard to break rules if you don't have collective power, and or otherwise you are making random attempts to do things. It's hard to organise against the kind of forces that exist out there now, and we have to be very smart and very organised to do that. So from my point of view, we can only operate in the world as it currently is, and that's complex, but it requires a lot of collective voice from many diverse organisations if we're going to win.
I'm not sure that I can see the equivalence, between the options available to we with few resources other than our time and our collective energy, and the corporates who bring in, large investments, huge political influence, a la Uber and so on, to get what they want. But what I would say is that I really strongly believe that the method for achieving people-centred regulation is still very rooted in the domestic sort of body politic and in community, the work that is done in communities, so that while, say for instance in the area of labour regulation, while it is heavily influenced by the forces of globalisation, by investment and so on, that the place for developing our industrial relations, rules, our culture, is still very much in the domestic, environment. So if anyone has to break the rules of this kind of international economic regime, then it's actually the state, in my view, that needs to break those rules. If there are rules against regulating to protect or enhance the well-being of communities and of the community for which you have responsibility as the state, then the state must break those rules. And, obviously the best thing we can do is prevent those rules being put in place, which is why we campaign against these kind of agreements. But there must be a willingness on the part of the state to break those rules in the interests of the community. I think that's the level at which that responsibility lies.
I was actually thinking about the old rules when you say that. Is it the old laissez-faire? First and foremost, in the age of global recession, I don't think we can go back to the old rules, right? I think that is actually a big problem right now that we are facing. The point right now is this: coming from the trade union background, I don't speak on behalf of the trade union movement, but the way that the trade union is reacting right now is quite reactive. And that's the reason why, for example, the civil society organizations are taking over some space in terms of holding those transnational companies accountable. But however, in the last 5 to 10 years, there are now some discussions about what can we actually do in order to make these free trade agreements and these transnational companies to be accountable. So there's a discussion about global framework agreement that global union federations are actually using. And there's also about discussion about supply chain agreement that we can actually bind and be part of those free trade agreement discussions. The problem is that these supply chain agreements is actually being discussed separately. But I think that is actually a useful tool for us in order to arrest some of those problems created by the free trade agreements. For example, there are some supply chain agreement that addresses anti-modern day slavery. And that supply chain agreement is actually, aside from government, business, trade union, there's a big part of civil society organizations that play in that part. So I think we have to continue that. There's a template and there's a platform. All we have to do is how we can actually maximize that and how we can convince the stakeholder, primarily the government, to advocate for those tools in terms of free trade agreement negotiations.
If people have questions, they should be raising their hands so I can bring the microphone whilst we've got.
Just really quickly, I'm not sure if it is an either or. I think it's a completely different alternative and maybe several different alternatives. I mean, one of the things that we've learned really deeply is that in complex situations, there is no silver bullet. It just doesn't exist. You've got to have many silver bullets. So I think one of the things, so our team is known for not following the rules. And do you know what? Hasn't served us badly, and in fact it's attracted investment into us. So we've grown from 3 people to 40 in just 4 years. So there are times where breaking the rules is a very necessary thing, or not following them. Probably I should be saying not following, not breaking, not following. One of the things I'm really interested in is those brave, smart public servants who are willing to do that and who are backed by brave, smart elected representatives and who are really willing to take that risk. I'm not sure, but we're recruiting, so if you know of any, send them our way, because we're a bit worried we might have picked the carcass a bit dry. Yeah.
I thank you very much for that, Dennis. I just want to say some people do ask those questions about the movement of migrant nurses. But the collective thing interests me, especially in view of that conversation about the Googles and the the Facebooks, etc. How do you how do you get that collective voice and mobilise people when basically so much of what's happening with trade and multinationals, etc., is the agenda is set way outside anything that we have control of.
The concept behind a new Auckland Community Alliance, which is called Te Ohu Whakawhanaunga, is that we build the relationships across diverse groups that want to see a reduction in poverty, that want to see flourishing communities. And then having formed those relationships, we develop a program of work that we're all committed to. And to try to step away from some of the issue-based politics that sometimes divide groups where we need the strength of as many as possible. It may mean that some issues don't ever see the light of day because there isn't a consensus around it. But there are really positive examples of where quite big structural and systemic changes have been made by building that kind of consensus across diversity.
Oh, I was just wondering, do we make sure the workers in China or other countries actually also benefits from our progressive improvement? Because I thought just a few months ago, the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese Premier, they both say we're all for globalization. They don't really they see the short-term benefits. They don't see the long-term price they are going to pay. It's like Taiwan used to be world factory where I came from, and now it's just ruined the environment. Same as China, they can't even breathe the air. And I was just wondering, is it actually part of the price that we have to accept because we want cheap labor, and they just keep it moving around now, move from China to the Vietnam or different country? And how do we actually keep the balance? Because Chinese people actually say, do you realize that how dirty, how polluted it is to produce all the solar panels for the, developed countries? And we have to have someone produce it, but how do we get rid of this kind of dilemma?
I think that's a really good question, and that is the sort of at the nub of the dilemma. I want to relate it back to the issue of the trade agreements and how it sort of works within that framework. Traditionally we had tariffs and other forms of protection for local manufacturing or local capitalism and local workers. And we've moved away from that to this belief that a free trade and investment environment will kind of lift standards by some miraculous process around the world. And obviously trade unions and workers in countries who've been negatively impacted by the opening of their markets to cheaper imports have said we want some constraints on that, which is why this idea of labour chapters and labour rules came into play. But the reality is that those rules kind of don't help either party. First of all, despite the fact that we've had these rules and agreements for 20 plus years, and mainly in the US agreements and often with South American countries or or the Middle East and so on, that there is no evidence of those leading, there are very poor connections between those rules and improvements in wages or working conditions in those countries. There's been one case that's gone the distance on the enforcement of those rules, which was the US case with Guatemala, and the US lost that case. So even though the tribunal said, yes, Guatemala has broken fundamental agreements, it hasn't, the US couldn't prove that had advantaged Guatemala in terms of its trade with the US, and therefore they lost. And all our agreements have the same problems. So, I mean, the reality is that these agreements have not improved, or these rules have not led to improvements in working conditions in those countries. What I think is the most important thing we do is preserve the space, the democratic space, whether it's here or in China or any other country, for the community in that country or the communities in that country to organise and assert themselves in relation to the regulatory system. So we might not like things that happen in other countries, but what I'm saying is that this approach hasn't actually made them better, and what it does do is that it limits the possibility in those countries for them to organise and win improvements themselves at home. So I think we have to be a little bit less paternalistic about it. I mean, let's acknowledge that our wealth has come at this through, hundreds of years of exploiting ourselves, in our own home countries, and exploiting people from poorer countries who've provided us with the resources on which richer countries have got richer. So I think we need to delete the paternalism, and the most important thing we can do is protect the space for people to organise and win domestically. And we don't do that by saying these are the rules you have to follow, because actually we don't enforce those rules because we want cheap products, and we don't have the capacity in our own civil society organisations and our unions to stop, imports and so on from those countries anyway. That's my view of it.
Annie, I wonder whether you could just tell us again the name of that Auckland coalition of groups that are trying to improve livelihoods for people.
Yes. Te ohu whakawhanaunga.
Te ohu.
Whakawhanaunga. So it's not actually formed. It will form in about 2 to 3 years, because between now and when we form, we want to bring on board all the organisations that want to have a collective civil society voice.
Third word.
Whakawhanaunga.
We'll give it to you.
Yeah, I'll give it to you later. I can write it up, maybe. I think Dennis wanted to say something.
Can I just add something about the Vietnam and China? The free trade agreement is actually easing the transnational companies' ability to offshore jobs overseas. In fact, the reason why some companies are shifting now from China to Vietnam, because the average minimum wage now in Vietnam is only 1/3 of the average minimum wage in China. And that's the reason why China is now circumventing the free trade agreement by engaging into a bilateral agreement through the public-private partnership agreement, which they're actually spending money and giving some aid and loan as well. But however, part of that agreement, what China does is that I'm going to build your train or your rail, but I have to bring my own people, to the point that they actually undermine the existing immigration policy. It happened to Samoa. It's now happening actually in the Philippines. In the Philippines, they had 15% unemployment, and yet there are 20 Chinese workers on visa. So just imagine that, okay?
Before we go to our last question, I also like this issue that doesn't matter which country you go to in the world, workers there complain about the migrant workers that are coming and working for lower wages. You know, it doesn't matter which impoverished country you are in, you find migrant workers who are working for even cheaper wages, you know, so something's got to break that cycle at some stage. Question at the back.
To the panel, thank you for your contributions. My question's about the concept of leisure. The figure known as Max Weber is known for his expression, one does not live to work, one works to live, or something along those lines. So my question is about the value we place on work. Do we overvalue the concept of work? And should we value the concept of leisure and its traditional meaning a lot more, especially anticipating the demographic, automation and technological change, and also climate change, which is and we're anticipating. So can I get some comments about the way people perceive the concept of leisure?
Kia ora, I think that's a really interesting question. One of the things that I thought of as you were speaking is that for example, Māori, we don't have a choice because we've been alienated from capital. So we can't use capital to create wealth or livelihoods, right? And this economy, New Zealand's economy has been built on the deliberate alienation of Māori from their capital. And we see that all the time in South Auckland. So, yeah, the idea of that actually lots of people just don't have a choice, and the perverse thing is that it still leads them into poverty when they are working, and that it places a whole new range of burdens and stresses on people, and it actually makes their lives poorer. Their mental health. I think that's something that we are really seeing in all of our employment and entrepreneurship work is mental health. It is the elephant in the room, and it is brought about by circumstances that are really wicked in their definition. They're really complex. And I think that idea about leisure, I equate that to actually having meaning and purpose in one's life, whether that's through work or whether that's through being part of communities. I think we have an issue with alienation from each other, and symptoms of that are things like, you know, why do New Zealanders have such terribly high rates of alcohol and drug abuse? It's because we're trying to get out of our heads, right? And we're alienated from each other. So that idea of leisure and actually how do we create an economy that's, you know, where people and the planet matter, and actually it enables people to have good lives, is a really, really great question to which I have no solution, I'm afraid. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, yes, one of the things that we struggle with in the South is this idea that any job is a good job. It's not. Poor jobs keep people poor. And actually we, you know, would advocate people staying on a benefit rather than going into some shitty go-nowhere job. It just places lots of stress on them, and that they can actually be home when their kids come home from school. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting provocation.
All right, I want to thank our panel, and I think we can take from that perhaps the way forward is to not consider going backwards. We can't go back to what we once had, that we need to forge a new way forward. That needs to be unions and community working together, and that we also need to be thinking about what it is to live, and that perhaps the way forward really is to put power back into our local communities to give them the voice. So I thank the panel again. Thank you.